Greetings, and welcome back to the Gaming Movie Jerks. This here is my top 10 favorite games list, the longest and really most epic entry in this here saga. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and get started. At number 10 is my favorite entry in the Bioshock series, Bioshock Infinite. This is the third game in the series, and the first one not to be set in the underwater city of Rapture. Rather, this one is set in the breathtaking floating city of Columbia. It's set in 1912, about 50 years before the previous entries in the series, and the plot follows the story of Booker DeWitt, who is tasked with capturing Elizabeth, the secondary protagonist. I don't want to give any more of the story away. This is one of those games that you just need to play for yourself. Let me just say that Booker and Elizabeth are some of the best characters in any video game ever. So how does Infinite compare to previous entries in the series? Well, the gameplay is similar to the previous games, but with a few interesting wrinkles that sets it apart, and in my opinion, improves on the previous entries. First is that you can only carry two weapons. I don't actually really care that much for this mechanic, because I basically just end up using the carbine on regular enemies and the crank gun on bosses and other tough enemies for the majority of the game. However, Infinite includes Vigors, which work similarly to previous Bioshock games' plasmids. However, I find the Vigors more creative and interesting than the plasmids. Another major change is the combat environment. Columbia is very open and includes these skyhooks that make combat more interesting. Finally, you'll find Elizabeth to be a very crucial part of combat, and that's all I'll say about that. Bioshock is one of the finest FPS games I've ever played, and I can't recommend it enough. Excellent story, gameplay, characters, and world building. At number 9 on my list is Punch-Out! Punch-Out is one of the most addicting games I've ever played. The premise is simple. You play as Little Mac, the perpetual underdog who works his way up through the ranks of boxing, eventually taking on heavyweight champion Mike Tyson. Or Mr. Dream if you're playing any version made after 1990. The gameplay is deceptively simple. Punch-Out is easy to get the hang of, but it's one of the most difficult games ever to master. Unfortunately, as I'm recording this footage, I haven't played in over a year, so I'm a bit rusty. Still, I'm doing the best I can. The fun in Punch-Out really comes from mastering each of the game's 14 opponents, including iconic ones like Glass Joe, Great Tiger, and Bald Bull. Each fight is unique and fun, and outside of the first couple, really hard. All in all, Punch-Out is one of the finest games the NES has to offer, and I would say it's easily the best sports game ever made. If you play this game, prepare to sink dozens, if not hundreds of hours into mastering the strategies necessary to beat your opponents and become the world champion. Next on my list is Portal 2. Portal 2 is the finest puzzle game ever made, and potentially also one of the best sequels I've ever played. I mean, how often is a sequel this much better than the original? Just consider how many ways Portal 2 improves over its predecessor. Whereas the first Portal can be beat in about 2 hours if you're good, this one took me 10 times as long. Not to mention the numerous new features that add to the complexity of the puzzles. Light bridges, lasers, and my personal favorite addition, the 3 types of gel, add numerous layers to the puzzles. These elements are used expertly to craft exquisite puzzles. But of course, 20 hours of straight puzzles would get old after a while, so Portal 2 includes segments without much in the name of puzzles, instead offering maps based around the ruins of Aperture Science that tie into the excellent story. Yeah, not only does this game have near-perfect map design for a puzzle game, it includes a hilarious story with eccentric characters like Wheatley and Cave Johnson. This game represents Valve firing on all cylinders from both their brilliant game designers and their fantastic writers. Up next is Minecraft. Is this one really a surprise? This game appears on all of our lists, so I won't really say anything about it. I can't say anything that hasn't already been said. At number 6 on my list is PlanetSide 2. This is an interesting game. I've never quite experienced anything like it. I'd argue it's the only FPS game that really captures the feeling of war. In this game, you're not some super soldier capable of taking on entire armies by yourself. You're just one small cog in the giant war machine. You have to work together with your teammates and use some tactics and strategy to dominate the other factions and capture the resource-rich planet of Araxis, one continent at a time. Speaking of factions, this game is somewhat unique in that it includes 3 factions: the traitorous, corporate-backed new conglomerate rebels, the disgusting cultist Vanu Sovereignty, and the glorious Terran Republic. Can you guess which one I play for? PlanetSide 2 is a really tough game to get into, but once you do, it can be tons of fun. Just be prepared to die a lot. Like, a lot. Like, I'm hundreds of hours in and scraping my way towards a .5 KD. Nonetheless, there is no other game like PlanetSide 2.
The rebels have been wiped out. Esamir is ours.
Oxygen Not Included is the next game on my list, and the only representation for strategy games on my top 10 list. Oxygen Not Included is a base building and resource management game in which you attempt to build a colony inside of an asteroid. Why is it called Oxygen Not Included? Well, you'll quickly find yourself running low on oxygen once the base oxalate reserves run out. It's a constant struggle to make sure that your colonists, or duplicants as they're called in this game, can breathe. From there on, Oni requires you to find out how to maintain all the various facilities and resources your duplicants need to survive. Once you've solved your oxygen problem, you'll quickly find that you need to get water fast. Then you'll need to generate power. After that, your base food supplies are probably running low, and you'll need to feed your duplicants. Most resources in this game are finite, so it's all about finding the most efficient way to do everything. This game may seem simple on the surface, but as you play more and more, you'll uncover layer after layer of complexity that gives this game near infinite replayability. Definitely one of the finest strategy games ever made. Far and away the most underrated game on my list, at number 4 is The Messenger. It's an indie game developed by a small team, but it's one of the finest platformers I've ever played. I don't want to spoil too much of the story, but let's just say that what starts out as one simple task, deliver the scroll to the top of a mountain, unfolds into a plot much larger than you might have originally expected. When I bought this game, I really just expected it to be what it looks like, a better version of Ninja Gaiden. And let me just say that the first part of the game pretty much is exactly that. Imagine Ninja Gaiden, but you actually feel like a ninja thanks to abilities that add depth and strategy that simply isn't there in the dated NES game. One of the key abilities that adds to the ninja feel is the Cloud Step. Basically, if you're in the air, and you hit an enemy, or a projectile, or really anything that can be hit, you're given an extra jump. This allows you to effectively stay in the air forever. This, along with your typical wall jumping ability, forms the basis of the game's platforming. The acrobatics you can pull off, especially once you get the grappling hook, are just an immense amount of fun. However, about a third of the way through the game, it changes up quite a bit. Let's just say that it basically combines Ninja Gaiden with Metroid. The world totally opens up, allowing you to explore the whole map at your leisure, guided by cryptic hints that at the very least tell you which area you're supposed to go to. The really neat thing is that some of the time you're exploring the same old maps you've already played through, but with a new dimension due to the time travel. Alright, I'm spilling the beans a little bit by mentioning the time travel, but that's hardly a spoiler. Look, just play the game. It's excellent from start to finish. Anyone who enjoys the old-fashioned platforming of Shovel Knight, or the Metroidvania aspects of Hollow Knight, or say Metroid, will enjoy this game. Give it a try and support the indie developers that made it. At number 3 on my list is another platformer, Mega Man. Specifically, my 3 favorite Mega Man games, Mega Man 3, 9, and 2, in that order. We're going to play all these games on the channel at some point, though by the time this goes up, Mega Man 2 is probably the only one that's actually been uploaded. Nonetheless, the Mega Man games portray platforming perfection, with a plethora of punishingly powerful robot master bosses. One of the things that really sets the Mega Man games apart is that you have to defeat 8 robot master bosses, but you can do them in any order you want. So one of the most important aspects of any Mega Man game is figuring out what order you're supposed to do the bosses in. The reason I picked these 3 Mega Man games is because I feel like they represent all the aspects that make Mega Man great. Mega Man 2 is generally regarded as the easiest Mega Man game, though it has one particular boss that isn't well designed. Watch our playthrough if you want more details. However, it has some of the series' best bosses, levels, and music. Mega Man 3 is probably the longest Mega Man game. Not only are there 8 robot masters, you have to fight all the bosses from Mega Man 2 across 4 different stages, and there's still the Dr. Wily Castle levels and 2 final bosses. Mega Man 3 is my favorite just because of the sheer amount of fun it has to offer due to its length. Finally, Mega Man 9, being a newer entry in the series, features better game design. Don't get me wrong though, it's still one of the hardest, if not the hardest, outside of the original Mega Man, but it features absolutely top-notch level design on top of the excellent bosses and soundtrack. Number 2 on my list is Half-Life. Just the whole series, they're all excellent, but I figured I'd talk mostly about the first one because, spoiler, but this is Caden's number 1 item on his list, so he's talked mostly about Half-Life 2, the arguably better game. For the record, all the footage you're seeing is from Black Mesa, a fan-made remake of the original Half-Life. It features heavily improved graphics and some gameplay improvements in the last couple chapters, which were easily the weakest part of the original Half-Life. Anyways, when Half-Life released in 1998, it completely changed the world of first-person shooters. Before Half-Life, shooters were actually usually just called Doom clones, and they mostly followed the Doom formula. You played through a set of maps, maybe with a loose storyline tying it all together, and it was all about the shooting. Enter Half-Life, a game that doesn't have set maps. Instead, you just traverse throughout the Black Mesa facility, making the world feel significantly bigger and more cohesive. This is the first FPS that really feels like it takes place in the real world. Half-Life is also one of the first FPS games to really focus on the story. The first 30 minutes of the game don't even have any shooting, it all just sets up the story. Ironically, the shooting is probably the weakest part of the Half-Life franchise, at least in comparison to those classic FPS games like Doom or Quake, or the games that were inspired by them, like Dusk. Also, the original Half-Life is definitely not perfect. There are a few chapters, like On a Rail, or the last couple chapters, that are far from perfect. Nonetheless, Half-Life is a revolutionary and incredibly fun FPS game that everyone should play at some point. Before I get to my number one pick, I'd like to talk about two honorable mentions, Fallout 4 and Dusk. Now, Caden already talked about Dusk, so I'll keep it brief. I'd just like to say that Dusk really is a perfect meld of Doom and Quake, especially in its level design, and it has the best weapon loadout since Doom. Now on to Fallout 4. You'll hear all kinds of people tell you that Fallout 4 sucks, or at least it sucks in comparison to New Vegas. It is true that Fallout 4 removed a lot of the more complex RPG elements, and it kind of forces you down one of a couple lame paths in what is honestly a pretty lame story. Wait, I thought this was supposed to be one of my favorite games. It is. Hear me out. Where this game fails in RPG and story, it absolutely excels in shooting mechanics and world building. The shooting in this game is night and day compared to New Vegas. Honestly, having played Fallout 4 first, I find New Vegas next to impossible to play just because of how clunky it feels. And the world of this game is excellent. I love how you just can't walk 5 feet in the Commonwealth without finding something interesting. I didn't use fast travel a single time for the first couple hours because I was just too focused on exploration. I've logged a couple hundred hours on this game, and probably a very small portion of them were actually spent on the main storyline. I did nearly every side quest and explored every inch of the map first, because that's the part of this game that's so good. Could you guess what my number one was going to be? I spent a lot of time comparing Half-Life to this game, not to mention the numerous times I've mentioned this being my favorite game. In fact, I do believe we even titled an episode of our Doom playthrough, Jordan's Favorite Game. Yeah, I like Doom. It's worth noting that while the original is certainly my favorite, you might as well lump all the original games in here. Doom 2, TNT Evolution, and the Plutonia Experiment are all good, though they feature more weak spots than the original Doom. However, the base mechanics for all Doom games constitute what I can only describe as perfect game design. Let me start with the weapon loadout. 8 weapons in the original Doom, 9 in the other ones. Fists, chainsaw, pistol, shotgun, chain gun, rocket launcher, plasma gun, and the BFG 9000. And outside of Doom 1, you also get the super shotgun. This weapon loadout is one of the best in video game history. Yeah, the pistol is totally pointless, but who cares? Every other weapon serves a very specific purpose. The shotgun is the standard weapon you'll use for most of Doom 1, and the super shotgun will serve you well in Doom 2 and Final Doom. However, the chain gun is perfect for a large crowd of fairly weak enemies, and it can stun certain enemies with its rapid fire. The rocket launcher is great for huge crowds and big bosses alike. The plasma gun deals tons of damage and has a very high rate of fire. And finally, the BFG is the ultimate weapon, though one of the costliest in terms of ammo use. It can literally take out an entire room full of enemies in a single shot, and it kills the final boss in 2 or 3 hits. Finally, when you have nowhere else to turn, the fists or chainsaw can be a last-ditch effort to protect yourself until you get more ammo. However, the chainsaw also stuns enemies just as well as the chain gun, which provides a cheap alternative if you're low on bullets. And the Berserk power-up will increase your fist damage by like 5 times, allowing you to one-hit anything weaker than a demon or specter. The weapon loadout is so versatile, and it encourages strategy and planning ahead for taking out the Hellspawn that awaits you in each map. Speaking of the Hellspawn, that's another area that this game excels. The variety of enemies will always keep you on your toes. Whether you're fighting a couple zombie men, or maybe hundreds of enemies at once, knowing how to approach each enemy and with what weapon to take them out is of utmost importance in Doom. Each enemy type makes a distinct sound when they're alerted, when they're roaming around the level, and when they die. This allows you to know just by the sound what enemies you have to take out, often before you can even visually process it. It's brilliant game design, and there's just enough variety that it never feels stale, but not so many different monsters that you feel overwhelmed, like it's impossible to remember all the different kind of enemies that populate each map. And speaking of the maps, that's another area that Doom really shines. Especially in Doom 1, the map design is just perfect at times. Doom 2 and Final Doom have a few bad spots, but they also have plenty of maps that are just as good as the best maps in Doom. There are other aspects of Doom that are fantastic, from the graphic design, the technological advancement that it represented, and the music. The soundtrack of Doom, and also TNT Evolution, is just fantastic. Sure, they ripped off a ton of heavy metal bands, but that's what makes it so good. Overall, Doom is, in my opinion, the most revolutionary game ever made. It perfected the FPS genre, despite being one of that genre's earliest entries. Well, that concludes our 3-part Top 10 Favorite Games series. I hope you enjoyed. seeing what all of our favorite games are, and please let me know in the comments section what you think of my games, what you think of my list, and what your own favorite games are, because I'm very interested to know. So we'll see you guys next time on the Gaming Movie Jerks.
On the Gaming Movie Jerks!